steering committee has been formative on developing these talks. Today, we'll be here till about 6:15. The first half, we'll be working with our panel on questions, and the second half will be a Q&A. Once we get to the Q&A, which is often the most fascinating part of the dialogues, we'll give ground rules then. One is be succinct. It was Eric Deggans who said that he used to think, from NPR when he was here, that change happened in a big way on televisions, on giant audiences. And then he realized it was quite different. It happened in the small groups. It happened around kitchens. It happened with dialogues. You know, early religions often happened around kitchens. And it was the great sage Krishnamurti who said, revolution starts right here with me and you. That's been the basis for our forums, me and you, us and you. We're not positing, screaming talks like on television. We're trying to listen, investigate, be aware, and somehow nudge our world and ourselves a little bit forward in understanding and openness. We want to present different opinions and views, but it's our job, like the ancients, to be around the campfire and begin with ourselves. On that note, I would like to introduce our chair of the steering committee, a board member of Florida Studio Theater, the chief judge of our 3 counties, and a person who's been formative in leading the platform on these dialogues, the platform of thought, of heart, of intellect, and of quality and attention of being that have made the difference in these talks as opposed to many others. Would you please welcome a colleague and my friend, Chief Judge Charles Wood.
Can you hear me okay? The first thing I want to do is, first of all, thank Kate and thank Florida Studio Theater for putting on these forums. Many of you have attended the forums over the years. I've been a part of them for 8, 9 years now. We wanted to create a safe place for dialogue. We also wanted to create an honest place for dialogue. So we hope to accomplish both of those tonight. So we are going to introduce 2 out of 3 of our panelists. The third panelist is en route. So the 2 panelists that are here, I'm going to ask to come and join me on stage. And I am going to introduce them once they have a seat. We have with us, to my immediate right, I'll introduce the Honorable Larry Eager. Mr. Eager was born in Chicago, Illinois, and I won't say the year. He moved with his family to Sarasota in 1968, so he's been here for quite a while. He's a graduate of the Sarasota High School, well, Sarasota Schools. Received both of his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Florida. He began working at a public defender's office as a legal clerk while attending law school. After serving as an attorney in the public defender's office for 24 years, he was elected as the public defender for the 12th Judicial Circuit, which covers Manatee, Sarasota, and DeSoto County. So please welcome the Honorable Larry Eager. And to the immediate right of Mr. Eager is Dr. Queen Zabriskie. She goes by Mecca, but I am going to call her Doctor today. I have known her for years. She is an esteemed assistant professor of sociology at New College of Florida. Dr. Zabriskie received her BA from Duke University, and she furthered her academic career at Northwestern University, where she received both her master's and doctorate degrees. Professor Zabriskie is co-author of a book called Black Theater is Black Life, an oral history of Chicago theater and dance from 1970 to 2010. Professor Zabriskie's primary teaching and research interests include race, class, gender, social inequality, dance, sociology of dance, black feminist thought, qualitative methodology, and cultural politics. So please welcome Dr. Zabriskie. So before we start, if I could get a show of hands of those who have seen the play Straight White Men. Okay, that's about 2/3, I think. So before we start, and because you have not seen the play doesn't mean that you can't take part either by listening or being active in our Q&A. But just for those who have not seen the play, I'm going to ask Kate to sort of give us a synopsis.
That's quite hard. I'm looking at my actors as well.
Oh, and hey, we do have a couple of actors here. So.
Yes, Jess and JP. You want to stand for a second? Sure. So, it's Christmas, and three brothers are celebrating the holidays with their dad. So definitely it's a male atmosphere. The mother has passed. There's something wrong, and I'm not going to do a spoiler alert, but one brother, something's different. Something unknown. And the rest of the play, we have to investigate what that is, who that is. And during that experience, as an audience and in the play itself, it becomes very subjective what is wrong. No matter who sees the play, each person has a different perspective. So we're watching a play within a play and bringing our own subjective experiences, but there's a great mystery that lies at the heart of this play, and a great unanswered mystery. So very different than most playwrights who wrap things up, hand you platitudes on silver platters. This young playwright, young Jean Lee, did none of it. She actually changed the rules. So when you walk into the theater, it's a different experience from the second you walk in. And we have one of the actors here from that experience as well. So I think that mystery, and at the heart, we can say though, it is about, or one of the themes that we'll be discussing is white privilege, which we're here today. So we can go into that.
And we were going to start by asking our panelists, first of all, if they believe that white privilege exists, and if it does exist, what's their personal definition of it? So I'll start with Mr. Eager.
Is everybody cold in here?
Yes.
It's freezing. My clothes are done. To answer the first question, yes. To answer the second question, I'm a lawyer. And so I'm opposed to personal definitions because that's what leads to misunderstandings. So privilege is, I went straight to the dictionary. And privilege is a special advantage or right possessed by an individual or a group, a right or advantage gained by birth, social position, effort, or concession. That pretty well encompasses what privilege is. I don't know if we really have to debate what the word means, but it is the gradations, I think, that go into debate, and our understanding of how privilege is applied to specific groups or individuals, or even as the play described, within a family, and how privilege can be distributed and expressed. So that pretty well encompasses my definition of privilege.
Okay, and Dr. Zabriskie.
So I say yes, white privilege does exist. And I am going to pull on some of the sociological and feminist literature about privilege. So Joseph Barn, who is actually more of an anti-racist activist, talks about privilege as, and white privilege in particular, right, as sort of rewards and benefits that individual white people get because of how our systems and institutions have been structured, right? So that it's important for understanding white privilege to understand the sort of history, right, of how particular systems have come into being, right? So it's the history of the criminal justice system, right? And the history of how particular institutions, right, have been created, right? And so I'll say that. Another definition of white privilege that I like comes out of the work of Peggy McIntosh, who has written a seminal essay about white privilege called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And she also talks about sort of these daily benefits, right? These daily rewards that white people get that means that they don't have to think about their whiteness. They don't have to think about identity, right? The play talked about comfort, right? One of the lines that I first remember was, when you're talking about the people who might have felt comfortable by the music was, enjoy your moment of comfort, right? So she talks about this whole series of, and she actually gives about 50 examples, right? Being able to go into the store and find products that allow you to do your hair easily. Being able to go and look for new stockings, right? And finding stockings that match your skin color. Being able to go into and get Band-Aids that are skin tone, flesh tone, and they match your flesh color, right? So these everyday, daily advantages or benefits or ways in which one's own identity, culture, history, being is not called into question, right? And the kinds of psychological, the kinds of economic, the kinds of sort of benefits that come from that, right? The lack of stress, right? Of having to figure out, okay, now how am I going to do my hair? And I got to go to this interview, right? So the kinds of benefits that come. And for her, they form this real kind of web, if you will, right? That is a structure, right? To go back to my first definition. That is a structure, right? That means that individual people have particular kinds of advantages. So I'll stop there.
Larry, I want to, you gave us a dictionary definition, but I want to put you on the spot because when we asked you to do this panel, you said, "Oh yes, I've been the recipient of white privilege my whole life." Will you tell us what you meant by that?
All right, well, using the play as a reference point and, kind of liking it, but the play forced me, I didn't say forced me, but it engaged me to think about what is white privilege or what is privilege itself. And so I look at my own personal experience, which is what my best frame of reference is, obviously, and I look at the history of my family, and I can assure you that my grandfather was not the recipient of white privilege. He fled Tsarist Russia and the pogroms of Russia to start a life here in the United States at the turn of the century. And so when he came here, he certainly was not the recipient of white privilege. My father then, being the good American and living in Chicago and going to the University of Chicago, did a good job of assimilation at the time. But again, my father, having been born in 1900, he suffered the trials and tribulations of anti-Semitism that existed in this country. Now, I am the second generation, and I've had none of those afflictions. As a matter of fact, I've participated in panels here in trying to, when we talked about the Jewish experience and anti-Semitism, I've never been really the recipient of anti-Semitism. So I have fully integrated and I have fully enjoyed the privileges that are bestowed upon me because I'm white. Just as important, I'm male and heterosexual, which is the three aspects that were covered with the play itself. So it would be really duplicitous of me to say, no, it doesn't exist, or no, I didn't benefit from it. And I know that even in the experience of having a son and a daughter, seeing the difference that society has, the constraints that are placed, or even my wife. For instance, my wife is an avid walker, and she loves to go out and walk. She walks at dawn, actually pre-dawn, and she feels more comfortable walking with our German Shepherd. I wouldn't give it a second thought. So there are gradations of privilege. We have put this at the apex, being white male, as the most privileged. And it's clear it exists within the criminal justice system. It's clear that it exists when you look at the disproportionate minority contact, the number of arrests that are disproportionate based on your ethnic and racial identity as compared to white males and the number of times they're stopped and questioned and arrested. So it exists, and there's no question that I've benefited from it. The question is, now that I've benefited from it, where do we go from here? And how do you address the problem beyond, talking about it, so to speak?
The question that I think would be posed is that too broad a stroke to say that because you're just a white male, you have this envelope of privilege. If you're poor and white and powerless and have no ability to exercise any type of authority over anyone, and this is both to you, Doctor, and Larry, is it disingenuous to say that person can exercise privilege? If you're poor, you're white, you're powerless, you have no ability to influence anyone either directly or indirectly based on your birth status. Is it fair to say that that person can exercise white privilege?
So if you look at research on the racial wealth gap, right? So here I'm thinking about the work of an economist, William Darity Jr., and actually one of my colleagues, professor at the College of Florida, Mark Paul, has a joint paper with Darity and a bunch of other authors looking at the racial wealth gap. And in their paper, they show that at every level of income, whites have more wealth, right? And so when they look at white families that are at the poverty line, they have about $18,000 in wealth, and black families have about zero, right? And so wealth is about, and when they look at high income earners, so this is not, this disparity is not about a kind of culture of poverty or bad behaviors by poor black people. When they look at earners at the higher end of the income scale, you still see a huge wealth gap, right? So rich and affluent blacks have less wealth than rich and affluent whites, right? So at every level of income, whites have more wealth, right? And so for Darity, and I agree with him, when we're talking about white privilege, right, we're talking about this sort of intergenerational transfer of wealth, right? That's one of the things that white privilege allows, right? And wealth is so important because it is the thing that allows people to weather any kind of downturns. So yes, right? And in fact, we all actually have some power, right? If we're being really honest, all of us have some power. In our families, in our institutions, everybody has some kind of power, right? We don't all have legitimate access to systems and institutions. We don't have the same kind of power within particular institutions and systems, right? You gave an example, criminal justice system, right? Every decision point, we know that blacks are negatively impacted, there's a disparity, a racial disparity at every decision point. So we know that everybody doesn't have the same amount of legitimate use of power in all institutions, but that everybody has some sort of power. And we know if we look at stuff like the racial wealth gap, poor whites actually have more wealth, which is the source of that privilege.
No, and I'm sure at some point, Mr. Eagle will refer to conversations that we've had in the past when we talked about the issue of race and whether or not really was it race or was it wealth or was it poverty that caused disproportionate numbers of African Americans to be incarcerated. Was it more about poverty? Was it more about race? And can you even separate the two? Can you separate poverty and race?
Can I just say one more thing? I mean, most of my work is on intersectionality, right? Because I don't know that you can necessarily always separate those two, right? We can isolate things to sort of try to figure out what's the impact, right? But I think part of what you were talking about in your answer, and I think the example that I'm given talks about how if we look at those things together, right, and we think about them as complex and intersecting and multiple, we can really, it's difficult, right, but you really get a sense of how, I don't want to use the word complex again, but I'll do it, how complex inequalities impact everyday experiences and life chances, right? And that's super important if we're thinking about how do we move forward, how do we transform things, right? We have to really get a sense of their complexity.
Mr. Eager.
It's hard to follow that. All right. In reference to what Charles was saying earlier, as the public defender, my clients all have one thing in common. They're poor. And so we have a system which has, for all practical purposes, criminalized poverty. And the majority of my clients are white. It's the disproportional component that we can't deny. And so from that perspective, we have, I mean, again, the complexity of the problem, it's not a simple one. My grandfather's experience, he came to this country fleeing persecution. The black experience was not fleeing their native land to come to this country. So again, the entire premise of the argument is different. So, and where it structurally starts from that point and moves forward is completely different. And we exist in a capitalist society that in many ways perpetuates this poverty. So these are the things that we have to examine if we want to bring about an effective change. And so, again, the reason I have been invited into these discussions is because of I have a love of the theater. And the love that I have for the theater is, in citing the work of Brian Stevenson, proximity. And for the most part, none of you here really do get to enjoy the sense of proximity. But the theater does bring it to, instead of you going to it, it comes to you. So you experience these things. So that when we have the first play that I ever participated in was Exonerated. I don't know if any of you have had an encounter with someone on death row, or has represented someone who's ended up on death row, and that experience. You can't experience it directly, but the theater has allowed you to come to it, or it to come to you, should I say. So these plays are important, the discussion is important. The resolution, there is no easy resolution to this. And, you know, one discussion that I had, culture goes through an evolutionary process. I'd like to think that we are evolving and not devolving, although that can be drawn into question from time to time. But the fact is, before we can even address a problem, we have to acknowledge that the problem exists. When you look at countries like South Africa or Chile that have gone through massive social upheaval, with Mandela coming into power, with Pinochet leaving power, what they established were truth and reconciliation boards so that you could confront and address the problem. We have had difficulty in this country in even addressing the issue of white privilege or what we have done to minority groups or to women or to our indigenous cultures that have existed in this country. So it is the recognition of the problem. Then we can hopefully move past it. But this idea of, oh, that was back then, or it doesn't happen now, or look at, we had a presidential candidate who was a woman, we had a president who was black, therefore we have evolved beyond that, is just, we're deluding ourselves.
I'd like to pose this for both of you. And I think, Doctor, you said our everyday experiences. And I'd like to move the conversation away from, say, the poor or the disenfranchised. Art has a tendency often to look at the disenfranchised or the poor. We can look at a poor community on the other side of the tracks and really investigate and sear and look at them. It tends not to look at the affluent. They're off limits artistically. There's very few artists that will look at the affluent and what affluency, the rights and privileges and rules. And I found that in working on this, and our culture culture for the first time is actually questioning some of that. Not for the first time, but look at the hashtag Me Too movement with institutions like television stations, where they're questioning some of these procedures, these experiences. One of the difficulties in this play for some of the audience, not all of them, is like, they don't behave like that. We don't. And some of the letters have been, well, we're white and affluent, and my sons would never behave this way. My husband would never behave this way. By behaving this way, they're not murdering anybody. It's a subtle interaction. So I'd like it to bring it back to the everyday experiences you are talking about, Dr. Mary, you're talking about, where this plays out. Where do we see it in the everyday? And this will be something for, I think, our audience too, but I'd like to start here.
So you're asking for stories? Okay. I want to make sure.
A story, that'd be great.
So I just want to say I agree with you in terms of the play being able to do that, right? And how difficult it is for some people to see, right? Themselves, right? And how denial, right? Is a part of the sort of process of trying to come to awareness of one's privilege and the ways in which perhaps one has internalized racism, right? So I was thinking about this because the other example that I didn't talk about was thinking about birth outcomes, right? And as an example of white privilege, right? And as an example of, I think upstairs you asked about whether white women, right? Benefit from white privilege. And of course I gave the example of Peggy McIntosh, who's a feminist, who's a women's studies scholar, saying yes, we do, right? Or white women do. And I also think about a lot of the research on birth outcomes, right? That shows that women of color, at every income level have worse birth outcomes. Black women in particular have worse birth outcomes than white women, right? And, people used to talk about individual behaviors, but people know now that that's not true. It's because of, institutional racism and the stress, right? The high stress levels and the ways in which that impacts birth outcomes. So I often, in my classes, tell a story about when I had my son, Muhammad. I have a 4-year-old son, Muhammad. And when I had him, he was in the NICU for a couple of days because something was happening with his breathing. And, I wanted to nurse him, but I wasn't producing milk. And so they said, okay, if you want us to take these wires out, you have to give him formula. And so I'm like, okay, well, let me go on the computer and do some research. And they're looking at me like, research, okay. So I'm like, I need to research what kind of formula, right? And so I'm doing research and they're like, oh, don't, milk-based formula will hurt the baby's stomach. You should look at soy or organic. So I'm in the NICU saying, hey, do you have any organic formula? And he's like, well, what does organic mean? And I'm like, okay. And so then I'm like, so I tell him what it means. And then I'm like, okay, well, what about soy-based formula? And the nurse says to me, well, the more exotic you get, the more expensive it gets. He's like, but I think you can buy soy formula on WIC, so I think you'll be okay. So he just automatically assumed I was on welfare, right? And so then my mother went around and told everybody, that's Dr. Zabriskie. She's a professor, right? Because I wasn't doing that. I don't walk in the world like that, right? And so she's like, that's Dr. Zabriskie, she's a professor. And so then everyone's attitude changed. Oh, doctor, oh, how are you? Oh, tell me, what do you teach? So everyone's attitude changed, right? And to me, that is an example of how that privilege, right, around education, around class, right, plays out, but also the disadvantage around race, right, really complex, right? There was an assumption that I was on welfare because I'm a young Black mother, right? There was an assumption I was asking for something that was outside of my means, right? Because you're right, most, in terms of numbers, most of the people in poverty are white, right? But in terms of the rates, that there are higher poverty rates for Black people in particular, for people of color, Black and Latinos, let me be real precise, for Black and Latinos in particular, there's a higher poverty rate, and we also know that there's a representation, right? Manima Liliano says, she's got a great book called The House That Race Built, and she says that poverty and crime wear a black face, not in reality, but in our popular imagination, right? And Stuart Hall says how people are represented is how they're treated, right? So that representation of Black folks as poor really impacted how I got treated, right? But then again, when I said, hey, I'm a doctor, right? That shifted, and I'm thankful for the shift, but that shouldn't have happened. You know, someone doesn't have to have, right, the education level that I have to be treated fairly in that situation when they're worried about how their child is going. Right? So that's.
Well, since we're getting anecdotal here.
Right. We are, because it's important.
The experience that I like to share was almost the reverse of that. And that's when I was just finishing my undergraduate degree. My best friend at University of Florida he was a doctoral candidate in the International Relations Department. He had taken his master's degree from Tufts University in International Law and Diplomacy and undergraduate was in Macon. He was having an emotional, tough time. And so my suggestion was, as a naive, white, privileged male, let's go to Sarasota. We get jobs in restaurants, that we can make lots of money, work short hours, and you can unwind. So he and I went from restaurant to restaurant, because I worked the restaurants throughout high school, and it was never any difficulty in finding a job as a waiter or whatever. Every job opening that we went to together, we were shut down. And then the realization for me, and maybe it should be a realization for you all here, he was Black and I was white. To this day, I defy you to go to St. Armand's and be waited on by a Black waiter. And so we went from restaurant to restaurant, shut down, shut down. He got somewhat disillusioned. I went to the first restaurant by myself, and I got a job. Every job that Gary went to from that point forward, he cut his credentials. I'm not getting my PhD because I didn't go to Tufts. I didn't. And finally he got a job, not in the front, but in the back. And it was as if it was almost threatening to anybody he was interviewing with that he was overly credentialed and the person who was interviewing him may have had a college degree, maybe. So that, I will say, in my formative years, recognizing, again, my own naivete, I believe in this sort of meritocracy. That's what my father raised me. By your efforts and energies, this is how you succeeded. That's how my father succeeded. I mean, he went to the University of Chicago not because it was one of the more prestigious universities in the country, but because he lived next door to it. His father didn't have the money to send him to college, so he worked his way through. So again, through merit, he succeeded. That opportunity lent itself to him. This opportunity did not lend itself to Gary. And so my recognition that these things are so prevalent, and as I said, this was more than 40 years ago. I do ask you to look around the next time you go to a restaurant and see that Black waiter waiting on you. So it's so prevalent and so permeates. Again, the discussion needs to be had. I don't necessarily have a solution to it.
Well, circling back to the play, before, I know we were going to open it up to Q&A, but Kate Alexander directed the play. And if you saw the play, you may have noticed something familiar about the boys in the play and maybe how they look. I don't know if it was apparent, but there was a certain haircut. And I wonder if you could give the audience perhaps your inspiration for how they look.
Thank you. Moderator. I will. I'll let the actors. Well, each one had a different haircut, and each one went into conversation, right, with our costume designer and myself. And I'll let you both talk deeply. But my inspiration was Judge Kavanaugh. because in those hearings which were going on, you could see that affluence, and that one actor is not here, but he's got the perfect haircut of where he could walk. It's that perfect prep school haircut, and there is a look, and there's a style of clothing. So everything we did had that gradation of clothing, hair, and look. Jess, why don't you say what your, and then JP, you.
What my haircut is?
Yeah.
I don't know, I haven't had one in a long time.
Here's the brother that's going different, right?
And he's been living at home and,
What school did you go to in the play?
I got a BA from Harvard in the play, and I spent 10 years at Stanford's PhD program, and then 10 years at various community organizations.
But something is very different, so when you do see it, you can check with him. But we started with the base of a look that we wanted. JP was at the beginning of the play, had a completely different, and go ahead.
So in terms of haircut, I mean, this is
Hairstyle.
The style. This is what I love going and working with you because I got to be me. There was an audience asking me like, which character are you playing? And I just said, it's me. So all the costume you see is my clothes and my hair changes throughout the different theme. You know, when we're dancing, my hair theme there is, you thought about it, is Whitney Houston, I want to dance with somebody. I had this big haircut there, so I love it that it's ever changing in every scene. You guys follow that?
Yeah, and that seems something small, but in mythology and throughout history, hair plays a critical role. Women's hair, Rapunzel, men's hair. So it's critical that we take that specific of a look at everything, even if they're growing it out or messy, that it starts with a base note of historically what it should look like. Okay, we are waiting for one more panelist as well, so.
No, he's not coming.
Oh, he was, it was our conservative
Well,
voice
you
as
know,
well.
just so that you know, there had been some criticism that some of these panels leaned a little to the left. And so, to his credit, we did have a panelist. I know he had some issues in terms of the time. And he's in your program, Rod Thompson, who's the founder of a conservative website and co-hosts a program called Right Talk America that kind of gives you a clue right there. And the reason it was important, I thought, to have him on the panel, he was on a panel for Native Gardens. I don't know how many of you saw Native Gardens. And so I'm going to sort of tell you what I think Rod would say about yeah, but and I think Rod would agree. You know, Rod grew up in Michigan. He grew up I think he grew up in Flint, Michigan. He grew up in a very, very tough environment. He grew up in a blue collar. I believe he would tell you that he had it rougher probably than anybody on this panel growing up. And,
He doesn't know that.
yeah. Well, that's what he would have said. That's what he would have said. And he did not feel, because the issue of white privilege came up in Native Gardens, he did not feel that there was such a thing. He felt that by calling something white privilege, you were personalizing something that for certain individuals, there was no such thing. He had no privilege. And so that would have been probably his position on this matter. And I would think he would also say that he felt that white males were under attack. He said that during Native Gardens. You know, certainly when you look at some of the things that have been coming to the forefront of the news in terms of everything from the Me Too movement to this issue of white privilege to attacks on affirmative action, things of that nature. He felt, and it's his opinion, that the white male in America is under attack from the liberal media for the most part. So I think that's the perspective that he would have brought to this conversation. And there may be people here that feel that way. And one of the questions that I was going to ask Rod was, you know, has there been some piling on of white males? I mean, is there a feeling, if you are a white male, that, look, I've never done anything wrong in my life. The idea that you may have benefited just by simply being white, Rod's position, I think, would be that's not fair to the individual. So, and I don't know, and maybe you have some comment.
No, if people are interested, can I give suggestions of 2 books?
Sure.
One is a book called Not Quite White by Matthew Ray. And he looks at poor whites, and he looks at the use of the label white trash. And he looks at how poor whites have historically been subject to very negative treatment, right? Because they have not been able to, or because they present a contradiction for ideas about white supremacy, right? So if we're living in a system that's white supremacist, I don't mean individual negative people, I mean a system and a structure that is telling you that whiteness and white folks are better than everyone else. If you have people who are poor and white, right, then historically that's been seen as threatening to this idea of white folks and whiteness as better than everyone else. And so you have a history of like forced sterilization in the eugenics movement, right? You have a whole other sort of host of negative treatment that poor whites have gotten. But what Matthew Ray talks about in this book is that this negative treatment has been in the service of one, still supporting white supremacy, right? And the ideas of whiteness as the pinnacle, right, of development, of humanness, of achievement and of success, as well as so still in the service of supporting white supremacy, and I forgot what else I was going to say.
Another book.
That's okay. Another book, Racism Without Racist, by Eduardo Bonilla Silva, talks about colorblind racism, right? And he talks about the sort of stories and the frames that white folks, and he looks at black folks too in one chapter because he talks about this as a kind of dominant framework, right? Through which we make sense of race relations and racial inequality. But he talks about the kind of frames. So you hear stuff like, I didn't own any slaves, I didn't do anything, how did I benefit? You hear ideas about meritocracy, right? And ideas about, hey, everyone should just have equal opportunities. So he talks about these like 4 central frames, right? Abstract liberalism. Oh, we have a meritocracy, everybody should have an equal opportunity. He talks about sort of like distancing, like I didn't own any slaves, right? And not thinking about, again, all of these systems and institutions in everyday ways, right? So that's another good book that people really want to, and that's a hard book for people to read, because it's another book, just like the play, that shows people to themselves, right? And so people want to sort of think about colorblind racism and colorblind racist discourse, right? And how that impacts how we make sense of racial inequality, and how that impacts our interactions with each other, right? And how that impacts how we do our work, right? That's another good book to look at.
Larry, you want to say something?
I'm not sure I want to tread into this, because again, my best foil is my wife, and we have pondered these conversations. And of course, in talking about white privilege, my thought was, well, a quarter of the world's population is in China. Is there white privilege in China? So
Yes,
it is a,
Right, colonialism had
Yes.
impact.
well,
Yeah,
it did, but you
And in
certainly
India.
can go there now and you can see, but it is Western influence that seems to have created this white affluence. You can say the same thing is true of India, but again, since we have done, or India has done the best they can to extract white colonialism from them. They have the vestiges of it, but you still have, the whiteness that we talk about really is a Western phenomenon that permeates the society. And again, so I'm not trying to take Rod's side on it. I'm just, it's just fodder for thought as to how is it that we've got this, the white dominance in Western culture. I looked to a book that I read some years ago, which was Steel, Germs, and
Steel.
and again, the anthropological that was my field of study, was anthropology. I wanted to find, were there universal truths that would apply to all cultures? Because what is learned behavior as opposed to what is inherent or biological behavior? And that's trying to understand those things and come to an understanding. And I ponder, I rely on academicians to delve into the study and give me a better understanding of things, which we seem to have, as a society, turned our back on science these days as well. But throwing poking things out there, but I shouldn't.
That's pretty big, because the Germans were noted for trying to find a scientific reason
That's,
for
well,
Western dominance, so it gets,
oh, absolutely. I
Very
mean,
exciting.
science has been misused. I'm not suggesting that it hasn't, but I want to have a better understanding.
But we go back to these questions, again, I'm speaking for Rob, because I believe when we had the Native Gardens Forum, he indicated he was the minority in his town, and he was the minority in his school, and he said it was impossible for him to exert influence. But that, and I think his position is a position that many people believe, including a lot of people who won't tell you that, and maybe that is one of the reasons that we probably have the president that we do, is because I think a lot of people believe that. And I think a lot of people, especially white males, do believe that they are being attacked, whether it's fair or unfair, because of things they had nothing to do with. And it's sort of made a cohesive force that I think has manifested itself, certainly in the last election. But we'll go to the audience. I
I want to
think.
open it up to questions. Ground rules, keep it succinct, or we'll cut you off, the police. And if you have a question, please address it to a specific person, or we'll open it up. So I see a question all the way in the back, and I will repeat the question so everyone can hear.
Hi, I am a new resident to Florida, Sarasota specifically, since December of 2018. So this is my first one, so I don't know how you've done this in the past. I have 4 succinct points I'd like to make. As an American, when I travel abroad, I do not feel any sense of racism or discrimination. I do feel, as an American, that I am a suspect. That's my first point. As an African American with white and black relationships in our family, my husband, who's sitting next to me, and I are one of 3 African American wife and husband relationships. So our children are African American, identified as African American. All the other members of our family are mixed race. So they will be, some will be part white, part Irish or German or whatever the case is. So we have felt for at least 30 years the blended mixed family experience. All of us are educated. Bachelor degree, master's degrees, doctorate degrees. That's my second point. The third degree.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So can I give you the other 2 points and then the question?
Yeah, we want to
Okay.
get to a lot of people, so.
Okay, the
just-
white.
just- Yes, we
So,
can.
I am a Christian, and I have found in my Christian places of worship, which have been predominantly in white Christian churches, that the dissension is greater than in the demographic of the people that we live amongst. My fourth point is, as an African American Christian woman, I feel that the direct attack on my family legacy is the problem. Because when my black children walk, and they're all educated and working in high-paying jobs, when they wear their naturals and their dreads and things like that, that's a part of the experience that is a problem for a lot of our black white. So I'd like to ask this audience, as well as the panelists, when you see us, not what you know about us, because you don't know me yet, but when you see us in the communities, what do you first think in your mind?
Okay, anybody want to?
Did everybody hear that?
Can you sum that up?
Well, I think we have to go right to the question.
Right.
And the woman who is African American has said she went through several things, feeling at ease in Europe, but not here. A family that is blended and differences. So her question was, when you look at me, at her, or someone of African American, or I imagine Hispanic, or someone, quote, who is different from the dominant white culture. And we could call it dominant culture as opposed to anything else. What do you see? What is the first thing you think of? You said people saw you as poor. So would anyone like to answer that? When you see a person of color coming down the street, what would be the first thing you think of?
A person of color.
All right, since everyone's speaking at the same time, I'm going to answer the question. What I see and what I want to see are two different things, and that's where the implicit bias comes in. I want to see a human being because I ask myself, in listening to this, I ask myself the same question. Who am I? What am I? Because believe me, the arguments that I've had at the dinner table with my parents when they were alive, I was the anti-Semitic son that they had because I'm very anti-Israel. And I do not like the fact that being Jewish and being pro-Israel are conflated together. They are two mutually exclusive things. So when I get into arguments with that, and it was sort of a nice sort of evolution that my parents began to accept my positions on these arguments. But am I white? Am I male? Am I American? Am I Russian? Am I a Jew? I'm all of those things. So what I strive for is seeing a human being. But even when I go through the process of selecting a jury, and when I have my client, disproportionate number are black, and I say to the prospective jury, because it's the only time I could engage them in a conversation, should my client have reservations about getting a fair trial, seeing that his lawyer is white, the prosecutor is white, the judge is white, the bailiff is white, all the personnel, and for all practical purposes, usually the jury panel is all white. And when the juror says to me, no, not at all, I strike that one off. Because if you can't acknowledge your own bias, I can't hope to get through to you my client's experience, which is what I'm trying to accomplish in the short period of time that I have the juror's attention. So, yes, that's what we strive for. I'd like to consider myself, and this is where it gets back to the argument with my parents. When I defend the position of the Palestinian movement or the Palestinians, and and then my father and mother's position is what they endured through the Holocaust, and I'm going to perpetuate that sort of degradation on additional people. I can't use the privilege of being Jewish as an excuse for oppression of anyone else. So that's my argument. I'm a human being first. And I've taken a lot of criticism for it, but that's my argument for it.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes.
No. Well,
Sorry, this is directed to Professor Zabriskie and many people, friends of ours, people of color, say, you just don't get it. You just don't understand. So given that I accept the concept of white privilege, do you think, without reading books you suggested, how does someone like me really, viscerally feel what it's like not to have?
and Kate, can you sum up your question, please? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I want to thank you. That was a brave question. These are both great questions. Thank you. This is a question to the doctor and to the judge. as a white male, he's often told, you just don't get it from a person of color. You just don't get it, you don't get it. So he said, if I don't read those books, and I think that's great, if I'm not intellectualizing it through facts and figures and books, what do I need to get? How do I get it? How do I get it? Doctor, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how and where to start, and knowing that we've done the Undoing Racism workshop together, right? And so you know some of the philosophy out of which I come and out of which I'm going to say this. I think part of what I love so much about that work and about the work of a guy, I said if I didn't read, sorry, but Joseph Barnes, what I love about his work is he says, he's trying to get folks to think about how is it that racism has shaped and really misshaped all of us, right? So that even though white folks have privilege, right? And I think we saw this in the play, right? There are absolute constraints on how people have to act, right? So even though white folks have privilege, there is some oppression there, right? That internalized racial superiority, right? The need to be competitive, the need to be, things about denial, things about distancing, loss, right? I love the fact that you're talking about intergenerational assimilation into whiteness, right? Because there's a lot of, one, not everybody became white at the same time, right? And not all groups have the same kind of access to whiteness, right? We're at a moment where, there was actually a recent debate, in the US Census, Middle East and North African people are classified as white. And there was a huge debate. Do we now need a Middle East and North African category, racial category, right? Do we kick them out of the category of whiteness, right? This happened to Mexicans, right? We know that not everybody has been become white at the same time. We know that the process of becoming white has not been the same, and it's not been consistent. Some people have had those privileges taken from them over time, right? But either way, the process of assimilating into whiteness means that there's some loss, right, that has to happen. A loss of language, a loss of history sometimes, a loss of culture, a loss of tradition. There's some dehumanization that happens, right? And so that there's privilege, right? But that sense of superiority is a kind of oppression too. And there's a kind of loss, and that's what we saw in the play, right? And there's a dehumanization that happens, right? When I have to sit and watch somebody being lynched, and I can't do anything about it, that's dehumanization, right? So part of it is tapping into sort of how you yourself have been misshapen, tapping into sort of how you yourself have been dehumanized by race, and thinking about what's in your own kind of personal self-interest for undoing racism and changing the system. Because oftentimes people think about, oh, I need to do this because I need to save those poor people over there, I need to save those poor black folks, those poor whatever folks over there. But really sort of tapping into sort of how have you yourself been dehumanized, what has your family lost, what has your family given up, right? What are the stories that you've heard about race? What's your first, we did this at one of so there's an anti-racism working group that now exists out of the Undoing Racism workshop that we had in Sarasota. And when we asked people what were your first stories of race, people told really horrific stories of wanting to sort of have friendships with people of different races and, in emotionally violent, sometimes physically violent ways, being told that that was not okay, right? So those are all moments of dehumanization, right? So tapping into your own dehumanization and how this has shaped you is part of it, right? Because then it becomes you're not getting it because of someone else and on behalf of someone else. You're trying to figure out what's your own self-interest. Who were you, right? Who were your people before they became white? What did you lose to assimilate into whiteness? One of my favorite stories I like to share with my students is from Chicago, right? Because we know Chicago has a huge history around race, right? And they talk about there was a news article about the Swedish Museum in Chicago and, collecting artifacts from families and how people were going into the basements and finding all of these old things that people hid away in boxes as they moved out from the city into the suburbs and assimilated into whiteness, right? And reconnecting with all of those things that were hidden and lost, right? And hearing